God's schedule for spiritual strength, or putting your child on God's schedule. We have a fascinating statement in the book Christian Education, which tells us that parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parents should open before them God's great book of nature. Okay, so we're having a description here. We have a description here of an early childhood educational program. Until what age? 8 or 10, okay? And by the way, the difference there is generally a gender difference, as we'll see in the research. It's around 8 years for girls, around 10 years for boys. And then it says that who should be the teachers at this age? Parents, all right. And the textbook? Nature, all right. Does this sound like a standard curriculum program today? Definitely not your average kindergarten. Continuing, the only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air, amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery, their most familiar textbook, The Treasures of Nature. Okay, until the age of 8 or 10, parents the teacher, nature the textbook, out of doors the classroom. Very different from what we see in kindergarten today. In fact, they did some research in kindergarten classrooms, and they actually did a comparison. And in 1998, they asked kindergarten teachers, is reading fluently too much to expect out of a kindergartner? And I would say, well, yeah, definitely. That's a lot to expect out of a 5-year-old child. Around half of kindergarten teachers said, yes, that'd be too much to expect. But then they asked kindergarten teachers 12 years later, in 2010, and they found only 10% of them felt that would be too much to ask. And so I'm just giving this as an illustration of kind of how our mindset has changed in what we expect for early childhood. They asked the question about, well, should children even learn to read in kindergarten? In 1998, around 30% of teachers said yes, but then 12 years later, it was up to 78% said, yeah, we should be teaching reading in kindergarten. They looked at how many children were in full-day kindergarten programs. You can see the numbers have gone up, or how much time they're spending in the classroom. Time for art and music has definitely dwindled, and they're losing out on a lot of those hands-on activities that children used to do in the classroom. In fact, 90% of kindergartners are being taught to read. 97% in classes where composing and writing complete sentences was part of what they were learning. And 99% learning capitalization and punctuation. So in other words, what we used to think of as kindergarten, right? A hands-on, play-based learning environment totally changed. It's now gone to a very academic focus. And this is at 4 or 5 years of age. There has definitely been a shift. School districts today report a more structured kindergarten program that centers on specific academic objectives and emulates what once was a grade 1 focus. So what they're doing is they're taking the things they used to learn at a later age and they're pushing it earlier and earlier. And we've seen this from different levels. From the political standpoint, government standpoint, kindergarten since the 1980s has become increasingly academic, with big pushes from President Bush's No Child Left Behind and President Obama's Race to the Top. Today, many children are being asked to do things they are not ready to do. Under the Common Core standards, here we see it from the curriculum standpoint, the snowball has escalated into an avalanche which threatens to destroy appropriate and effective approaches to early education. The kindergarten standards in use in over 40 states place huge emphasis on print literacy and state bluntly that by the end of kindergarten, children are to read emergent reader texts with purpose and understanding. So we see it from government, we see it from curriculum, and we see it from a societal standpoint. An increasing societal focus on academic readiness has led to a focus on structured activities that are designed to promote academic results as early as preschool with a corresponding decrease in playful learning. All that, to sum that up, we've seen big changes in early childhood education. We're pushing for academic study more and more. In fact, 30% of U.S. kindergarten children no longer have recess. I mean, this isn't university. 30% of kindergarten children no longer have recess. 5 and 6-year-olds are being asked to sit doing math, reading and writing for hours at a time, sometimes with no recess or a very short one. Some teachers have dispensed with snacks during half-day kindergarten because there just isn't any time. Many kindergartners take home homework every day. Teacher-led instruction in kindergartens has almost entirely replaced the active, play-based experiential learning that we know children need from decades of research in cognitive and developmental psychology and neuroscience. Big changes. Children are being asked to do academic learning at an earlier and earlier age. The question is, does this have a scientific basis? Okay. We read the counsel that says until the age of 8 or 10, parents should be the teacher. They should be learning from nature. They should be learning in the out of doors. And here the world's going the opposite direction, pushing the academics at an earlier and earlier age. Is that because of science, or is that due to other factors? The fact of the matter is, it does not have scientific support, this push for academic learning at an earlier and earlier age. There is no research evidence. From an article called At What Age Are Children Ready for School? There is no research evidence to support claims that earlier is better. By contrast, a considerable body of evidence clearly indicates the crucial importance of play in young children's development, the value of an extended period of playful learning before the start of formal schooling, and the damaging consequences of starting the formal learning of literacy and numeracy too young. And they mentioned play. We could add useful work to that, right? We talked about that last night, the benefits of learning those useful things in the home. Useful work is excellent. So, what is too early? We're going to talk today, this afternoon, about early formal academics. This is our 10th tactic on the list that we were looking at this morning, damaging good thinking abilities. What is too early? The weight of evidence from the scientific perspective definitely agrees with the counsel that we have that until the age of 8 or 10, the academic setting is not ideal and would definitely be considered too early for proper development. So let's turn our attention to the science and see if it supports the counsel we've been given. Let's talk first of all about some brain development. Anyone know what this is? It's a neuron. The synapse is actually the connection between the neurons. All right, so this is a neuron. It is, of course, more commonly known as a brain cell. It's what your brain uses for all of its functions. And there are several processes of brain development, synaptic pruning being one of them. But one of the major important factors is something called myelination. Okay? Myelination is the process by which the axon of the neuron is coated with an electrically insulating compound called myelin, and it speeds the information processing. When we talk about a brain area developing, this is the major factor we're speaking of, that along with synaptic pruning. When we see, a child learning to talk, learning to walk, learning to move, and we see it's an amazing process, right, to see all this grow. A lot of what is happening in the background is the neurons are myelinating. What that does is it allows the information to be transferred over the neuron efficiently. So without the myelin sheath, the information travels so slowly that it's unusable. As it myelinates, the brain says, okay, now we can start using these neurons. As is explained by this scientific article, myelination of appropriate brain regions coincides with the development of specific cognitive functions, such as reading, development of vocabulary, and proficiency in executive decision-making. Just giving a few examples. As we see things develop in a child, that's the myelination process occurring in the background. So, trying to force an information transfer over an unmyelinated neuron or areas of the brain which are unmyelinated is a pretty futile effort. They're not ready to receive this information transfer. So the next question would be, okay, what sort of schedule does this occur on that would enable certain brain regions to be ready for certain types of learning? So this myelination process occurs in stages and on a pretty set schedule. So if we start at birth, all but the most essential bodily functions are unmyelinated. In other words, most of myelination occurs after birth. And let's look at a schedule for this myelination process. This is taken from Dr. Carla Hannaford's book, Smart Moves, and is a great oversimplification of the process. I don't want anybody to take from this and think that they've mastered neuroscience. This is just a tiny, scratch of the surface, oversimplifying the process. But from conception to 15 months, we have basic brain development. From 15 months into around 4.5 years, the limbic system and the relationship areas of the brain are developing there. And it would be important to mention, this is why it's so important for those little ones to be with their mom as much as possible. That limbic system has a lot to do with their emotional security, emotional development, as do relationship areas of the brain developing in those first few years. That connection with mom is vitally important. Then at around 4.5 years to around 7 years in girls, a span of time there, we have the gestalt areas. Dr. Hannaford uses the word elaboration. She's referring to the myelination process. And notice I said to 7 years in girls. So it's about 9 years in boys. Boys, as I've noted there on the slide, boys have a slower growth period during these stages than the girls. I did not say boys were slow, but they do develop differently, okay? And God made it that way. It's interesting that the right hemisphere has a lot to do with spiritual strength, and I believe God wants our men to be the spiritual leaders. It's interesting they take a bit longer in developing these areas of the brain. Fascinating. So they do need a longer period of time developing this part of the brain. Then at around 7 years in girls, at around 9 years in boys, the logic areas of the brain begin a period of development, and then at around 8 years, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe continues into the early 30s. And the left hemisphere's logic areas continue for into the 20s even. And I just want to focus on these three areas: the right or gestalt areas, the logic areas, and the frontal lobe. Now, let's compare these two hemispheres of the brain and look at the functions of each one. The left hemisphere tends to deal with things such as detail, parts and processes of language, linear patterns, critical thinking, logic, numbers, reasoning, and the right hemisphere tends to deal with things like images, rhythm, emotion, intuition, imagination, creativity, feeling, faith, belief, and large motor control. So, looking at these two hemispheres, which one would be very important for academic learning? Definitely the left, right? That's not to say you're not going to use the right, but you need the left hemisphere for the numbers, for the critical thinking, the logic, all those things, very important, all right? Now, I mentioned frontal lobe also. Connected with that, the primary motor cortex, a vitally important area of the brain responsible for fine motor development, for inner speech, which is important for reading. I'll talk about that in a moment. Fine motor eye teaming and foveal focus, again, important for reading. And so with that in mind, of these areas, left hemisphere, primary motor cortex, that are vital for academic learning, let's go back to our schedule. There we are. What age? All right, we saw the left hemisphere, important for academic learning. What age does it begin its major period of development? Around 7 in girls, around 9 in boys. Do we have a problem? What's a typical school starting age? 4, 5, depending on the state. You may, sending them to preschool at 2 years of age where they're learning a lot of academic things too. What happens if we try to ask the brain to learn something before that area is not ready? As it turns out, we can actually cause some problems. Now, I do want to clarify here before I continue to explain. This is not purely anatomical. I'm not indicating that the right hemisphere does all of its development while the left hemisphere just sits there idle and then switches over to there. No, this is very involved. The brain is extremely interconnected. And in fact, there's parts of the right hemisphere that develop before the left. There's parts of the left that develop before the right. And this is why we use the term gestalt and logic. This refers more to the functions of different areas of the brain. So what is really very accurate to say is just that the areas of the brain responsible for many academic types of learning are not developed until around 8 years of age, and even about 10 in boys. So, can we accelerate learning? Can we speed the process up somehow? That's what we're trying to do as a school system, right? We're like, we want them in school at this early age, so we're just going to try to force them to learn it. what happens? Well, as it turns out, damage is done. Trying to force those brain regions to learn things that they're not ready for is actually going to cause problems. It's a myth that we can accelerate a child's developmental milestones. Children are kind of pre-programmed to reach those points. And I find this interesting from a secular scientist saying children are pre-programmed to reach those points. Who pre-programmed them? Didn't God make them that way? Right? And that's what he's saying. So to understand this, let's understand how plastic the brain is. The brain is adaptable. So the plasticity of the young mind allows it to adapt to the situation. And it also allows, if there's a region that has not developed or that is damaged and unusable, the brain can fill in with another part. I was talking with a neurosurgeon a while ago, and he was telling me how, they can remove parts of the brain and other areas will fill in for the part that has been removed. And it's an incredible ability of the brain to adapt. But the problem is they'll never be as efficient as the originals, as the correct region. So if we imagine here a 5-year-old in class being asked to do something that he doesn't have the correct area of the brain developed for, what is the brain going to do? The brain is going to compensate, okay? The brain is going to look around and say, all right, I don't have the correct higher thinking centers of the brain developed yet. Let me find somewhere that has myelinated. What has myelinated? The brain develops from lower to higher. So the very basic thinking centers of the brain have developed at this early age. So the brain starts routing the thinking, the learning, through this lower thinking center of the brain rather than the correct region, and it forms a habit. Later on, when you try to advance in the academics, you face problems, you face burnout, you face learning disabilities, you face learned helplessness, and all these problems we deal with because the thinking has been routed through the basic thinking center and it's formed a habit through there. The brain doesn't automatically switch to the correct region when it's developed because you've already forced it into a habit earlier. Let me just explain here with a simple explanation. If a task is asked of the brain for which the corresponding region is not matured, it will form neural routes through lower, more developed sections, resulting in almost permanent organizational damage. Trying to force a child to learn a concept for which they are not ready can actually do damage to the unmyelinated brain. Now that's an explanation from the science. Let's look at a few statements from the research. Dr. Jane Healy, educational psychologist, before brain regions are myelinated, they do not operate efficiently. For this reason, trying to make children master academic skills for which they do not have the requisite maturation may result in mixed up patterns of learning. If the right or the correct brain system isn't yet available or working smoothly, forcing may create a functional organization in which less adaptive lower systems are trained to do the work. Trying to drill higher level learning into immature brains may force them to perform with lower level systems and thus impair the skill in question. So we actually damage later learning by trying to push it too early. We've been sold this idea that if we start early, then the children are going to be, setting them up on the right foundation to be able to learn better later. But actually the opposite is true. It damages later learning. And it creates often what is known as learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a phenomenon where the young person, the child, may be perfectly capable of learning something, but they believe that they are not able to. They believe that they are helpless at learning. As Dr. Raymond Moore explains, a child who is required to learn things before he is ready may quickly tire of them, or he may become anxiety-ridden and so frustrated that he will not try at all. Dr. Healy, I often wonder how many children decide they're dumb about certain subjects when the truth is that someone simply laid on the learning too soon in a form other than the one they needed to receive it in at the time. Notice, decide they are dumb. They're not really dumb, but they decide they're dumb about it. Many children acquire learned helplessness at school when they are confronted with learning tasks that are too difficult for their level of ability. And I would contend that much of today's school failure results from academic expectations for which students' brains were not prepared, but which were bulldozed into them anyway. Any learning that has to be pushed into a child may end up doing more harm than good. Do we need more research? I mean, this really establishes it quite clearly, right? And I love the words of Dr. Healy here. Plunge daily into the fire of inappropriate expectation. Children's early promise shrivels and non-learning becomes a habit. They may be labeled, treated, exhorted, and eventually tutored, but the basic issue remains unchanged. The school and the child are on different schedules. And that's the problem. We have too many schools and children on different schedules. Now let me explain here. This is not to say they're going to be failing at school. But they often will struggle to learn the concept. Let's use an example from math. A lot of children you give them a math problem to solve, give them the equation on paper, and they can run the calculation. No problem. But if you give them a word problem where it's a real-life situation and they have to figure out how to solve that, all of a sudden they're like, I don't know how to do this, right? Is it because they don't know how to solve it, or they don't understand the concept? See, they don't understand the concept. They don't understand how to actually apply it. And so that's just an example of routing the thinking through the wrong part of the brain and forming a habit. So some keys to make this practical. Parents need to be patient. Sometimes we get in a rush. We want to push them in the academic learning too early. Just give it some time. Now, does that mean to indicate that we shouldn't be learning, that children shouldn't be learning? Absolutely, they need to be learning. It's just learning the correct things. And so you can learn a lot in practical, hands-on ways rather than with books. And then, of course, focus on character. We'll be talking about this more in depth in a few minutes here. Now, brain development is one aspect. What about the eyes? Let's talk about the development of the eyes. Eye teaming refers to the ability to use both eyes to focus on a subject. That's very important for reading. Foveal focus is two-dimensional focus, and these functions don't fully develop until approximately age 7 to 9. Both of these very important for reading. Now, less than 5% of vision actually occurs in your eyes. Your eyes are a lens for your brain. For full vision to occur, information from all cerebral lobes must be accessed. And so, even though a child may be able to see what they're looking at, they're not understanding it, not able to decode it. And so you're not able to have full reading. Also, the eyeball is not completely shaped with collagen fiber until approximately age 9. So long periods of reading without relaxing the focus into the distance could possibly cause inflammation and the elongation of the eyeball, leading to myopia. All right, myopia is a term that we don't use quite as much here in the US, but we often call it nearsightedness here. Myopia is the most common eye problem in the world. And in fact, the rates of myopia have been going up. Rates of myopia, difficulty seeing distant objects, are soaring. The trend is matched in many other countries, causing eye doctors to wonder what could be causing the decline in human vision. And for many years, eye doctors have said this was genetic. But recent research is showing that genetics are only a small factor. Let me explain. Here we have a normal eye compared to the myopic eye. Now, the normal eye is very rounded in shape, and the focal point is right at the back of the eyeball. Whereas the myopic eye becomes elongated. This is not working very well. The myopic eye becomes elongated, and it changes the focal point to farther back in the eyeball. Now, when we look into the distance, our eyes are at rest. But as you look at something up close, the muscles on both sides of the lens of the eye, called the ciliary bodies, they have to contract to bring the vision into focus up close, all right? And this is called an acute spasm of the ciliary bodies, and nothing wrong with that if it's done short term. But as you focus on that thing up close, especially a young child with his soft eyes, as they focus on something up close for a long period of time, those ciliary bodies begin to contract, and they hold that contraction. And they begin pulling on the outer layers of the eyeball, and it begins stretching the eyeball, causing the myopia. Now, it's interesting to compare the rates of myopia around the world. The US is about 50% myopic, and that's pretty bad. But East Asia is 90% myopic. Is there a difference in lifestyle between these two areas of the world? Is there a difference in the amount of time they spend indoors? Is there a difference amount of time they spend studying? Absolutely. East Asian children spend twice the amount of time in homework that the average U.S. child does. Is it possible that there is a lifestyle factor here? They did a study in Alaska, shortly after Alaska became a state. Who's old enough to remember when Alaska became a state? Anyone here? 1959 was the date. I think there's a few of you past that age. 1959, Alaska became a state, and it was a unique situation because there were large populations of the Inuit, the Eskimo, in Alaska. And so when Alaska became a state, they started requiring all the children and young people to go to school at this early age of 5 or 6. The parents and grandparents had not gone to school. Children and young people had. They looked at the rates of myopia. Now, the children were 60% myopic. If myopia is purely genetic, what percentage of myopia would you expect to find in the parents and grandparents? The same, right? Or even more because of age-related issues. Well, here's what they found. Can you see it? Less than 1%. And they said, there must be more than genetic factors here. So they started doing some studies around the world, and they found it was very connected to lifestyle. The US, 50% myopic. East Asia, 90% myopic. Compare that to Africa, a continent that's still predominantly indigenous. A lot of people spending a lot of time outside, even children I've worked in Africa at some schools, and even children who are going to school are often walking long distances out of doors, both morning and afternoon, so they're getting a lot of physical activity, outdoor time, 10 to 20% myopic. And as they started doing these studies, they realized that this was very much a lifestyle factor more than a genetic factor. Natal, Brazil. They found in the city of Natal, it was around 13.3% myopic, whereas indigenous northwestern Brazil, 2.7% myopia. Again, connected there to the lifestyle. They found among the indigenous people of the Upper Rio Negro region of the Amazon rainforest in northwestern Brazil, they found myopia was rare among the indigenous population. And this is interesting. Age was not associated with the refractive errors of the indigenous people. Everybody says you develop this with age. And they found no, age was not the major factor here. Brazilians from the small city in which the study was performed had higher rates of myopia. What do you think was one of the lifestyle factors there? Living in the city, they're more indoors and more time in school. Older pre-education adults had a very low prevalence of myopia, whereas younger, slightly educated Brazilians had a higher prevalence of myopia. And they concluded the research by saying that the low prevalence of myopia in the illiterate indigenous peoples is consistent with other studies and suggests that myopia is related to literacy. What they failed to note in this study, though, is you often don't see myopia develop in children who start the literacy later because the eye has firmed up. So they're saying it's related to literacy. Well, that's because most of the children are going to school at an early age. So the lifestyle factors in the development of myopia, first and foremost, is doing the close-up work. Looking at things up close is stressful to the eyes. But then there's another factor, and that is the lack of time outdoors. Research is clear that the more time children spend outside, the lower the rates of myopia. Children who spend less time outside are at a greater risk of developing myopia. Now, let's go back to this chart we looked at. The normal eye, rounded in shape. The myopic eye, elongated. Okay? Keep that term in mind as we read the next statement here from the Journal of Nature in the article Myopia Boom. Light stimulates the release of dopamine in the retina, and this neurotransmitter in turn blocks the elongation of the eye during development. Wait a minute. Elongation. Wasn't that what we just saw here? Elongated eye, that's myopia. And they found light causes dopamine to be released in the retina of the eye, which blocks the elongation of the eyeball. Okay, light. What kind of light? What's that supposed to mean? I mean, are our kids supposed to be staring into a flashlight to help prevent them getting eye problems? No, certainly not. All right, so I continued in this research. Mentioned in this article was actually Dr. Ian Morgan, who's a myopia researcher in Australia. He says children need to spend around 3 hours per day under light levels of at least 10,000 lux to be protected against myopia. Okay, great, but what in the world is 10,000 lux? Go outside, stand in the sunlight, and you're getting actually more than 10,000 lux. You go in the shade, and you're getting about 10,000 lux. So on a sunny day like it is today, stand in the shade, you'll get about 10,000 lux. Lux is a measurement not of the brightness of a single light source, but it's the total volume of the light. So you might, for example, outside those windows, outside those doors, you're getting 10,000 lux, okay? But you come into this room, and the lux, the volume of light that's coming in these windows becomes dissipated into the volume of light in this room, okay? And the lux measurement begins to go down drastically. Does anyone want to guess who hasn't heard this presentation before? If the average classroom is, if outdoors is 10,000 lux, what is the average well-lit classroom or office? You want to go halves? Okay, 5,000. Anyone want to be pessimistic enough to go 2,500? No, you don't think it's that low? What was that? 2,000, he thinks. Okay. What was that? 1,000. Pretty pessimistic guess. It's actually 500. Far below what is necessary for the development of the eye. I was doing a seminar in New Zealand a while ago, and someone raised their hand and said, no, actually here in New Zealand, we require 700 lux. And I was like, great, but that's not 10,000, right? It's not 10,000. I was recording in Austria. They were doing some recordings in a church, and the director of the television studio came up to talk to me afterward, and he said, actually, I have a lux meter here. I'm going to see if you're right. I said, oh, let's see. So he goes outside, he opens it up, 12,000 lux. It was in really full daylight. And he comes inside, opens it up in the church, 475. So again, far below what is necessary for the development of the eyes. I have a friend who, and I've heard this story from others, just a friend of mine experienced it, so I really saw it firsthand. She was about, she had severe myopia, and she was about 12 years old. She was going for her yearly checkups to the eye doctor, and one year, when she was 12, she went to the eye doctor, and he checked her eyes out, and he said, you know, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but your myopia is progressing so quickly that as you're entering puberty, it's going to make it even worse, and you're going to be legally blind in about a year. Can you imagine hearing that? Going to be legally blind in a year. The mother asked the eye doctor, well, what's causing this? Is there anything we can do about it? What do you think the eye doctor said? It's genetic, he said. Nothing you can do about it. It's genetic. You and your husband both have bad eyes, so she's going to have bad eyes. So she went home. She was thinking about it on the way home. She goes, wait a second. The Bible says the curse causeless shall not come. There's a reason for things. And she said, besides, if it was purely a genetic factor, why does my son have perfect vision? And my daughter is about to go legally blind. So she did some research. She found this study about spending time outdoors. She goes, oh, that's interesting. She said, there's a connection here too, because my son loves outdoors. I can't get him inside. Whereas my daughter hates going outside, spends all her time indoors. She said, well, this is worth an experiment. Talked to her daughter, said, we're going to have a new family schedule, and you are going to go outside for at least 2 hours every single day. No, Mom, I don't want to do that. Big battle. She's like, no, this is the way it is. You're going to go outside for at least 2 hours every day. So she did. She went outside. She would do her homework outside. She'd practice her violin outside. She wasn't really getting the whole idea of like physical activity and agriculture and those things, but hey, at least she was outside. She was getting the 10,000 lux. 6 months later, they went back to the eye doctor. He checked her eyes out, and he said, well, this is interesting. your myopia has not progressed. They said, thank you very much. Didn't tell the doctor what they were up to. A year later, went back to the eye doctor. She should be almost legally blind now, right? He checked her eyes out, and he said, I don't quite understand this, actually. You've seen no progression in your myopia. Your eyes are the same as they were a year ago. And so they told the doctor what they were up to. He said, look, we found this research, spending the time outdoors. You think there's a connection? Oh, no, he said, that's just coincidence. No, this is God's method, right? These are God's methods at work, and God's methods work. By 2050, studies show half the world will be myopic, and 1 billion people at significant risk of blindness if current trends continue, according to a recent study published in the journal Ophthalmology. The eyes need to actively experience the world as a whole for vision to develop fully. They're not going to get this in the classroom. It's actually damaging to their eyes. They did a study on monkeys. Since the eyes of certain monkeys are nearly identical to human eyes, a hood was used to restrict the vision of such monkeys so that they could see no farther away than 15 inches. It was found that most of them developed high myopia just as humans do. Monkeys living in the wild, however, do not develop myopia. So again, the research is very, very clear. All right, so to make this practical, spend several hours outside every single day. And by the way, this is definitely applicable to not only children, but to adults also. I had a seminar a few weeks ago, and some people were talking to me, and they said they'd been listening to my material, and both the husband and the wife told how they decided to implement these things that were good for children for themselves, and both of them have stopped wearing glasses. The husband actually said that it was on his driver's license that he's required to wear glasses. He had pretty severe myopia. And he broke his glasses, I think was the case. I don't remember what it was. And rather than going to get them fixed, he's like, okay, I'm going to follow this program. No screen time. I haven't talked about that much. But yeah, the screen's very damaging to the eyes. So he almost completely got rid of his screen time. And he spent several hours outside every single day, got rid of the glasses. He's no longer wearing glasses, and he can see pretty well, actually, not requiring that. He recently took the test again for his driver's license, the vision test, and he said when he took the test, he told the lady, I think your machine's broken. My eyes are worse than this. She said, okay, take it on this machine. And it was the same. His eyes were almost completely healed. So God made our bodies to heal, right? Why do we exclude the eyes from that? And I'll also mention that eyeglasses actually make the problem worse because eyeglasses, remember, it's looking at things up close that strain the eyes. Eyeglasses take the distant objects and they bring them closer to the perspective of the eye. So it continues to perpetuate the problem. That's why you have to get stronger and stronger eyeglasses as you go. And you can look it up online. There's actually quite a few articles and methods out there for healing your eyes. But of course, the best thing to do is prevent it from occurring in your children. Spend that time outside every single day. Limit the close-up work and the reading. Limit and eliminate screen time. All right, point number 3, physical development. What are the 2 most common commands given to children in the classroom? Sit still and be quiet. Sit still and be quiet. Let's talk about sitting still and being quiet. Certainly that's a valuable skill for children to learn. But as they engage in it day after day for long periods of time, it is not healthy for their development. Physical activity is vital. We've talked already about the benefits for the cerebellum, a very important area of the brain. Physical activity greatly aids the development of the cerebellum. Also, physical activity enhances the growth and greater connection between the neurons. In order for a child to be able to sit still, pay attention, and remember the shapes of letters and numbers, which is school, of course, the child first needs to have developed his or her proprioceptive system, which is a sense of the body and space. How do they develop that system? Whole body movement. Things that children love to do: jumping, climbing, running, clambering over things, swinging their arms around. It develops the proprioceptive system. And that actually helps them with academic learning. There's also something known as the brain-derived neurotropic factor. mercifully shortened to BDNF. This brain-derived neurotropic factor is essential for the development of the brain, and it's been termed miracle grow for the brain. It's very beneficial for even the adult brain. It is released when we exercise. So as we move our muscles, the active muscles cause the release of a chain of proteins that cause the release of BDNF in the brain. And again, it's beneficial for all of us at any age. But most interestingly, BDNF is required for myelination to proceed. When you look at the chemical process of myelination, that process of the brain developing, BDNF is part of the mix. It can't occur without sufficient BDNF. So literally, children have to move for their brains to develop. When we tell a child to sit still for hours every day, we are preventing their brain from developing. As Dr. Catherine Davis says, I think that parents need to go to educators and say, why is my child sitting down for 6 hours a day when he's a 7-year-old boy and he needs to move? Can you imagine if we all asked that question? That's a good question. But this was no surprise to God. He told us, small children should be left free as lambs to run out of doors, to be free and happy, and should be allowed the most favorable opportunities to lay the foundation for sound constitutions. God knew that this was the best environment. Now, I want to clarify something here. So we've had the tendency to read this and misinterpret it a little bit. Free as lambs to run out of doors. We think that means you feed them breakfast in the morning, you open the door, boot them out the door, come back for supper time. Free as lambs, it says. Have you ever seen any lambs? Not many lambs here in Chicago, but has anyone ever seen any lambs out in the pasture? There's always someone nearby. That's mom, the mother sheep, and the shepherd, of course. Pretty interesting symbolism there, of course. But the mom is nearby, guiding, protecting. So this is not saying the absence of the parents. This is talking about the environment that they should be in, this active environment out of doors, which tells you something. Where do the parents need to be? Outside with them, right? Developing that relationship also. So as much of the day as possible should be active, and then definitely play together with your children. This is an important part of developing a relationship with them, playing with them. And play actually has a lot of benefits. I saw an article recently. The title was, "Children should learn mainly through play until the age of 8, says Lego." Well, I guess they probably would say that, right? But as I looked at the research, it was actually quite clear, very good research, and children do need play. It's part of their development. In fact, we're told, give some of your leisure hours to your children. Associate with them in their work and in their sports. Win their confidence. Cultivate their friendship. And the use of the meaning of the word sports here just refers to play in general, being with them. Now, we don't want to leave out work, though. We talked about the benefits of useful work. And again, work together. Engage in physical activity. This is excellent for development. So that's about sitting still. A lot of problems when we make a child sit still for long periods of time. What about telling them to be quiet? Have you ever seen a group of children playing? We've all seen this. Are they perfectly quiet? Hardly, right? Why? Now, what about when you just have one child playing by himself? Is he perfectly quiet? Yes. If he is, you're worried, right? If it gets too quiet. No, most of the time, a child playing by himself is talking to himself, chattering away about whatever he's doing. And that's because children don't have something known as inner speech. Inner speech is the ability to internalize our thoughts without having to say them out loud, okay? Most of us as adults, we do develop this ability of inner speech. We still catch ourselves talking to ourselves. That's okay. But we have the ability to think without saying it out loud. Children can't do this. Children actually have to think out loud. So when we make them be quiet for hours a day, what are we doing? Preventing them from thinking, okay? It's a necessary part of development. And children also really connect their senses with what they see and what they hear. And you ever notice a child, they reach for something and they say, "Let me see that." You're touching it, not seeing it. Just look at it. No, they need to touch it. They need to feel it. They engage in a lot more whole body way than we do as adults. Good language, like the synapses that make it possible, is gained only from interactive engagement. Children need to talk as well as to hear. The problem is in the classroom, we talk to them, but not with them. I'm convinced that the major reason so many students today have difficulty problem solving, abstract reasoning, writing coherently, is that they have insufficiently developed mechanisms of inner speech. So to make this practical, helping them develop inner speech, helping them develop their language abilities, definitely need a quiet and simple lifestyle. They need individual time with adults also, and they need a chance to be allowed to talk to themselves. And then, of course, talking together is very important. But I skipped a slide here, and I want to go back to this one. So insistent is the need for outer speech, to hear one's own voice and thoughts, that silent reading is ineffective before the age of 7. When we tell a child to sit there and read to themselves before the age of 7, or even 8 or 9 in boys, they're not getting anything out of it. They're not really benefiting from what they're reading if it's just reading to themselves. They need to say it out loud. So engaging in conversation with them is an excellent way to help this develop. In fact, they find that the number of words an infant hears each day is the single most important predictor of later intelligence, school success, and social competence. How are they hearing those words, though? Interestingly, what they find is just hearing them is not enough. Live language in a warm, emotional context with a caring adult, not endless, mindless television or video games, boosts language development. Information received in an emotional context is more powerful in stimulating neural development than information alone. Even the tone of voice makes a difference. And there's a lot of research that has shown similar results. And, there's been a trend of late. I'm thankful for the recordings that we have, audio devotionals and things. But parents, in an effort to save time, they give their children the audio devotionals to listen to. But the research shows that they will not benefit from that as much as sitting on mom and dad's lap and listening to mom and dad actually read to them. Even a recording of the same voice does not impact the brain in the same way that listening to it live will do. Which means those of you watching online are not getting quite as much out of this seminar as those here in person. But of course, we're glad that you could be with us. So let's talk for a moment about emotional development. Emotional development is vital. And we used to kind of view emotion and cognition as these two separate areas of the brain, but we now recognize they are absolutely interconnected. Furthermore, emotional security actually lays a foundation for cognitive development. Emotional security is seen by the brain as a fundamental need of survival. And if the child is not receiving good emotional security, they won't be able to do well academically. This is why a good researcher, if they're dealing with a child with a learning disability of some kind, will actually investigate the home environment. And often they will find some kind of emotional disturbance, be that abuse, neglect, divorce, something like that, and it often triggers a learning disability. That's how strong the connection is between emotion and cognition. So if we want a child to do well academically, we actually need to lay a foundation in good emotional development. The best way we can do this is quality relationship. Quality relationship builds emotional security, which then lays a foundation for academic learning. Emotional well-being and social competence provide a strong foundation for emerging cognitive abilities, and together they are the bricks and mortar that comprise the foundation of human development. The emotional and physical health, social skills, and cognitive and linguistic capacities that emerge in the early years are an all-important prerequisites for success in school and later in the workplace and community. So, They need this connection with mom and dad. When we send them off to school, we're breaking that connection many times. But more than that, even if we have a situation where we have the children in the home with the parents at an early age, but we're asking them to learn things that are not appropriate for their level of ability, this can cause problems also. When children have educational experiences that are not geared to their developmental level or in tune with their learning needs and cultures, it can cause them great harm, including feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and confusion. You see what happens when we ask the child to learn something that they are not ready for. They experience this difficulty and this frustration. But who is asking them to learn those things? Well, it's somebody they trust. It's mom, dad, or a teacher. And so somebody they trust is asking them to learn something that they're struggling with so much because the brain isn't ready for it. And so what do? They blame themselves. They think that something must be wrong with them. And so we're causing an emotional disturbance just by asking them to learn something that they are not ready for. That's not to say we can't challenge our children, but we need to know what they are and they are not ready for, and not be asking them to do something that they simply are not ready to learn. And so we need to make sure we socialize primarily within the home in the first few years, and then develop a solid relationship with the children and spend time together. The child relates to people and to the world primarily through interaction with parents or parent surrogates. Even the best daycare cannot completely neutralize the negative social, emotional, and cognitive effects of mother-child discontinuity. When the child is allowed to develop a strong bond with an adult, especially a parent, a much more emotionally stable and socially competent child will be the result. Let's mention socialization. I talked about that this morning. We talked about the importance of age mixing rather than age segregation. And I talked about the benefits of that for socialization. They should be socializing within the family. And what the research shows is definitely in line with that sending the child off to school at an early age often results in what is called negative socialization. Yes, they learn to socialize within their age group, but they don't learn true socialization in a mix of ages. And there was a little boy I did a research report on, and he was about 5 or 6, and he was experiencing some significant emotional challenges. He had a lot of anger problems. He was often picking fights with his siblings, and he was very, what's the word? He didn't want to be touched very much, didn't want to be hugged, really standoffish, and just struggled to develop connection and relationship. He had plenty of what we would often call socialization. He had his peers at school, he had siblings, he had the neighbor kids, he had plenty of kids to interact with. What he didn't have was secure connection with his parents. His dad was in school, his mom was just kind of negligent, and when mealtime came, he just went and got something out of the refrigerator himself. His mom wasn't really there to do much with him. He was kind of just raising himself. Even though he had a comfortable home to live in, it was him just taking care of himself most of the time. And he was experiencing all these difficulties. And so I was curious, the impact of, kind of the point of my research was just the impact of relationship, even from someone who wasn't part of the family, what impact that would have on him. I started twice weekly, spending a half hour with him, and we would just do fun stuff together, carry in the firewood and spend some time in the garden and take some walks in the park, just basic stuff we did together. I was there to listen to him, there to talk to him, interested in what he was interested in. At the end of a couple of months, this little boy had completely changed. When I came to visit, he would run up to me and give me a big hug. He would never have done that before. The anger problems had almost vanished. He was able to get along with others better now. He was more obedient now. His mom actually noticed, which was remarkable that she noticed. His mom actually noticed the changes in his behavior. And it was all just from a little investment in relationship. Can you imagine what a difference it would have made if the mother had invested an hour a day at minimum? What a difference that would have made. So this is really what children need. They can have lots of contact with other children, but they need that connection within the family, with adults especially. Now, what about memory skills? This is an interesting one. They actually find that children who go to school at an early age don't have as good of memories. And if we contrast this with indigenous peoples around the world, we find that they actually have very prodigious memories, but they haven't gone to school. The North Queensland Aborigines, for example, recite a song by memory that takes 5 nights to complete. I can't remember all the words to a hymn out of the hymnal. Primitive peoples can observe a herd of several hundred animals and detect the absence of a single animal and know which one it is without counting. Many of their vocabularies are full of names for very detailed aspects of the world around them. When I first read this, I thought, wow, no way. Then I spent some time in Tanzania, Africa, and I was sharing some of this research at a mission there, at a school. And a young lady came and talked to me afterwards. She said, you know that statement you read about seeing the animals and knowing which one is missing? She said, that's absolutely correct. I said, really? Tell me about this. She goes, yeah. We have cows here at the mission, a herd of about 70 cows. And she said, our native herdsmen, we hire native Maasai to take care of our cows. That's a famous tribe in Africa, right? She said, they'll take the cows to get water in the evening, and they just take a glance over the herd, and they're like, oh, such and such a cow's not here. And she said, one day I asked them, it's like, can you just tell me how to know when we're missing a cow? Teach me. I'm the livestock director. I'm supposed to know this kind of stuff. And they're like, how do you not know when you're missing a cow? Isn't that obvious? It was just common sense to them. They never really thought about it. Part of the connection here, while the schooled person depends heavily on external signs, such as the written word, to hold knowledge for him, the primitive native depends on memory. Every detail of a landscape is remembered with what seems to be a photographic memory, even the first time passing through. Though most children have an eidetic memory, it is rare among schooled adults, but not among primitive non-schooled adults. So it seems we're actually schooling the memory out of our children. By teaching them to memorize, we're making their memories worse because something else always holds the memory for them. I have a friend who told me the story of, I think it was his father-in-law or a friend of his father-in-law who was a missionary in Africa. And he traveled to a village one time to give the sermon, give the message. And he gave the message and left. And 2 years later, he went back to the same village and was invited to preach in the church again. He got up in front of the church and he was just making conversation. He said, how many remember when I was here 2 years ago? And they all raised their hand. Yeah, of course we remember you from 2 years ago. He said, that's great. And he's kind of kidding around and he goes, well, how many remember the sermon I preached 2 years ago? And they all said, yeah, of course we remember the sermon. He goes, really? What was it? And they kind of hesitated for the minute. And they, well, you mean like what was your title or what was the actual sermon? There were people there who could recite that sermon verbatim, having heard it once 2 years before. So no, it seems school is not necessary to develop good memories. And of course, we want to develop a good memory in our children to memorize Scripture. And it seems that these peoples are onto something with that natural lifestyle. Point number 8, and that is reading skills. This is definitely an important one. Now, some of you are starting to look like I've been telling you to sit still and be quiet for too long. Why don't you stand up for just a moment? Get a little stretch. Take a deep breath. Yeah, that lunch is sitting heavily. Our brother over here want to lead us in some calisthenics, right? All right. Arms in the air, take a deep breath. Oh, and let it back out. Good. Great. Reading skills. Now, a lot of parents are worried about reading skills, and legitimately so. That's an important ability, to develop the ability to learn to read, or to be able to read well. Certainly a concern. Now, let's just look at how literacy is doing here in the United States. 21 to 23% of adults in the United States function at the lowest level of literacy, or they're completely illiterate. Another 25 to 28% are low-level literate. It's nearly 50% of the population either illiterate or functioning at low levels of literacy. Only 18 to 21% are fully functioning literate at the highest level. That was based on a 2002 report. They did another study in 2012, and they found basically the same results. And so the trend has continued. So, this is the system which is pushing reading earlier and earlier, and here's the results it's producing. Can we do better than this? I would think so, right? Contrast this, and this is interesting, contrast this with the Scandinavian countries, which for years have had later school entrance age, 7, 8, or even 9. They have nearly 100% literacy rates. So, how can we develop good reading skills? Firstly, it's a myth that they need to learn it early or they won't learn it very well. Numerous studies have found those who start later actually do better with reading abilities. And many parents are worried, though, because they want their child to learn to read on time. Okay, we say this, on time. And they're like, oh, they're late because of what? That's the question. In many schools, children are identified as behind with reading before they would have even started school in many other countries. In other words, what's on time? Who says that the way we do it here is on time? Let's base this on science, not on arbitrary school starting ages. Okay, so let's look at the science. To understand this, we need to consider what develops a good foundation for reading skills. The Early Childhood Research Quarterly, a well-respected journal in early childhood research, found that the foundation of later reading, and in particular reading comprehension, is language. Okay. So if we want to develop good reading skills, where do we start? Language. How do you develop good language skills? Talking to them, right? This is pretty simple. And this is actually what the research shows very clearly. If a child that develops good reading skills is often a child who has had a lot of conversation with their parents at an early age. So the very first thing you can do in developing good reading skills is simply talk together. And this shocked me when I first saw the research, but a study found that parents spend an average of 3.5 minutes in meaningful conversation with their child. 3.5 minutes, how often do you think? Per day, you think? Per week. 3.5 minutes a week on average in meaningful conversation with their children. And when I looked into that, I was like, how in the world is this possible? But when you get into meaningful conversation, that eliminates when families sit around the TV and they, say a sentence to each other or comment on something. That's not meaningful conversation, right? Meaningful conversation, 3.5 minutes a week. And so that's a major change. Isn't that the instruction given in Deuteronomy, though? Whereas God told the parents, as you walk by the way, talk with them. This was to help their reading skills. You can also answer the questions and engage in incidental learning. Toddlers love asking questions, right? Their favorite question is why. Why? Hey, take advantage of that to teach. And when they ask a question like, Mom, how do you write my name? Mom, what's that letter? Mom, what's that sign say? Dad, can you read me this book? Take an opportunity. That's a minute here and there. Read to them. Explain to them how to write their name, whatever it is. A minute here and there. And you're actually putting together the building blocks in the brain for reading. The time will come more often than not, a child will teach themselves how to read if the brain is ready for it. Also, make sure books and reading are a source of gaining needed information about something. And what I mean by that is in contrast to a forced reading drill. Like, you have to learn how to read, and so here's the Dick and Jane reading series. Dick and Spot ran, and it's very boring. Make sure it's something where they ask a question. Hey, good question. Let's look at this up in the book. Or, Mom, can you read me a story? Yeah, sure. Here's a story. Let's read it. Make it something interesting. And what the research shows is that learning to read is actually quite easy. If we follow these steps, I'll back it up there so you can see this. If we follow these steps, most children will teach themselves how to read, especially if you have a natural environment, lots of practical activity, you're creating a motivated learner. A child who is very curious to learn, they will teach themselves how to read. And I've lost count. It must be in the hundreds, maybe thousands of parents who have told me how their child just taught themselves how to read. And it's well supported by the data. I remember one mom told me the story. Her child, I think he was about 6 or 7, her little boy. I think he must have been 7. I don't remember. But anyway, he came to her one day and he had a book, and she hadn't really been teaching him how to read or anything, just reading stories to him occasionally and doing the things we're talking about here. And he had a book in his hand and he said, "Mom, I want to read you a story." She said, "Okay, go ahead, read me the story." And she's expecting the book is going to be upside down and it's a made-up story. You know how children like to do that. And so he opened the book and it was upside right, and he read her the story, the actual story on the page. And she's like, "He doesn't know how to read. How do you figure this out?" And she thought, he knows that story really well. He's probably just memorized it. So she turned to another part of the book that he didn't know very well. She said, "Read me that story." And he read it to her. And in her words, she goes, "I was kind of upset because I'm like, it was my job to teach him how to read, and he beat me to it." But then she realized she had been teaching him. It was just everyday life, a minute here, a minute there. He was interested in life. He wanted to learn. And so he just taught himself how to read. When the time was right, he'd been putting all the blocks together in his brain. He finally connected it, and he was able to read. So it doesn't need to be the long, drawn-out process that we often make it out to be. Now, let's look at a little bit of research. Again, this is from the Early Childhood Research Quarterly. They looked at 2 groups of children, and they found the earlier reading instruction age group had initially superior letter naming, non-word, and passage reading, but this difference in reading skill disappeared by age 11. The later reading instruction age group had generally greater reading comprehension. They compared. Here's 2 groups of children. This is looking at measuring their average decoding and reading fluency. And then the blue is age 5, and the orange is age 7 that they were taught to read. So if we look at age 5, see if I can get this to work. Here we go. Age 5, they're beginning to be taught how to read. Age 6, we have a few of the next group who is teaching themselves how to read a little bit. They developed a few skills on their own. And then at age 7, they are beginning the second group in their instruction. Then at age 8, if we just make this comparison at age 8, what would we conclude? Definitely better to start earlier, right? Look how advanced they are, starting earlier with reading skills. But then, look at age 9. Look what happens here. The group who started earlier sort of plateaued in their abilities, while the group who started later caught up. Look at age 11. Those who started earlier have passed the ones who started, did I say that right? Those who started later passed the ones who started earlier. It was 2 years of wasted time to start at age 5. They found children who started at 5, developed less positive attitudes toward reading, and showed poor text comprehension than those children who started later. They also looked at Montessori schools, which teach reading pretty early, and they found no advantage. The Montessori children had an advantage in reading over public school children at age 5, but not at age 12. Again, the difference disappeared. Our findings suggest that success at reading is not assured by an earlier beginning. They actually did better waiting. Now, they did another study in kindergarten classrooms. This was fascinating. This comes from Ruth Beechick in her book, 3 R's. It is true that some children can learn to read remarkably early. But the fact that they can does not necessarily mean that they should. Should is another question. One school district set up an experiment to help decide this question. Some kindergarteners in the district received extensive instruction in reading. Others spent the same amount of time learning science. They melted ice, they observed thermometers in hot and cold places, they played with magnets, grew plants, learned about animal life, and so on. Books and pictures were available for these children if they wanted them, but no formal lessons in reading were held. Okay, 2 groups of children. One group, they're teaching them how to read. The other group, they're like, hey, go have fun with science. Now, after a couple of years, which group do you think would have better reading abilities? Clearly the ones who were taught reading, right? By 3rd grade, the science children were far ahead of the reading children, not in their science scores, in their reading scores. The reason? Their vocabularies and thinking skills were more advanced. They could read on more topics and understand higher level materials. The reading children, by starting earlier, used up a lot of learning time on the skills of reading, while the science children spent the time learning real stuff. And when they did begin reading, they were older and knew more and learned in a fraction of the time that the others took. Again, I just say what a waste of time. Starting earlier, it's not helping them, it's actually hindering. So to make this practical, definitely talk together with your children, very important. Read to them. We tend to focus on that a lot. I don't mean to indicate it's not important. Certainly it is important. It's not the only factor, though. Definitely allow plenty of time for movement and activity, and utilize the questions and engage in incidental learning. All right, point number 9. Nearing our last couple of points here on this topic, the effect on boys. Unfortunately, boys get the short end of the stick with starting school early. Because of that approximately 2-year lag in brain development in boys compared to girls, all the effects we just discussed will be intensified in the boys. And I believe that's intentional. I believe that's intentional on the part of Satan. God wants our men to be leaders, right? Satan doesn't want that. We've seen an attack on men in recent years, and today boys are not learning as well as girls. Boys receive 70% of the D's and F's given all students. Boys cause 90% of classroom discipline problems. 80% of all high school dropouts are boys. Millions of boys are on Ritalin and other mind-bending control drugs, and 3 out of 4 students labeled learning disabled are boys. Did God just create boys to be a problem? I asked that question one time, and young brother and sister were sitting on the front row, and the sister was quick to assure me that yes, boys were the problem. Of course, that's not the way God made it, right? Boys are active, though. God made them that way. And God wants that activity to grow into leadership, to be channeled correctly. But the problem is, we put boys in this environment where they need a more hands-on, active learning environment, but we sit them there at the desk, make them sit still, and try to act like the girls. The girls often do better in this environment than the boys. And as a friend of mine, or as I've heard it said, we're treating boys like defective girls. Treating boys like defective girls, right? We're comparing them to the girls. The girls are doing fine, the boys aren't, so there must be something wrong with boys. They just learn differently, though. There's nothing wrong with them. They're just learning differently. I think one of the most misdiagnosed problems in childhood today is ADHD. The correct diagnosis, boy. Boyhood. Boys are more active. That's okay. God made them that way. And when we try to sit them down in the classroom at this early age, they're going to struggle. That's not to say, I want to clarify, that's not to say that boys can't do well academically. Absolutely they can, but they're going to struggle more at an early age. They need some more time before we start them in the academic environment. The early curriculum is more accelerated than ever before. Boys are expected to do too much too soon Their brains aren't ready for it. They begin their school careers in a dumb group. They're frustrated with their lack of ability. They start disliking school, and they begin to avoid it. We're seeing that more than ever now. And that is definitely the problem. They've actually done a few studies. In one study, they found boys with summer birth dates tended to be advantaged academically by postponing kindergarten entrance 1 year. So just a 1 year delay was hugely advantageous to the boys in many studies. All right, let's mention ADHD and other attention problems. This is obviously a topic that we could spend a lot of time on, but just to mention it here, the ADHD is very connected with early schooling. Children need the activity. When we try to sit them down in front of the desk and we try to ask them to learn things they're not ready for, they're going to struggle because they want to be active. And so we think, well, they must have an attention problem. No, they don't have an attention problem. They're just a child who needs to move. But we label them with that, and the problem continues. They actually found delaying kindergarten for 1 year, only 1 year delay, reduced inattention and hyperactivity by 73%. Do you realize how big that is in the research? Usually we see 1 or 2 or 5% or something. No, 73% by only a 1 year delay. And it virtually eliminated the probability that a child at that age would have an abnormal or higher than normal rating for the inattentive hyperactive behavioral measure. That comes from Professor Thomas D. at Stanford. Now, the question is, won't they be left behind? If we delay starting school until 8 or 10, how will they catch up? Won't they be forever behind? No, actually, they'll do better. Research shows children who start the academics after age 8 usually end up far ahead of the early starters. And when children are given time for their minds to develop, they'll experience a lot less frustration when the academics do begin, and they'll learn much faster because they are ready to learn it. Extensive research supports this. In a study of 300 individuals who started school at about age 8 or later, all of them quickly caught up with their classes and in most cases performed well above the class average. There's substantial agreement among school entrance age researchers that children who enter school later are significantly higher in academic achievement than those who enter earlier. Most late starts, usually without formal training before their first school enrollment, quickly catch up academically and often pass their more school experienced peers. And the late starters generally excel in behavior, sociality, and leadership. But I hear what you're saying, okay, yeah, but how? How do they actually catch up? How does it look practically? The studies find all the learning necessary for success in high school can be accomplished in only 2 or 3 years of formal skill study. So there's actually a lot of wasted time when we start early because there's a lot of repetition because the brain isn't ready for it. Let me give an illustration here. Now this is not, I don't mean to say this is exactly what is learned in each grade, but just as an illustration of how curriculum works. So in first grade, we have problems like this, okay? Basic addition. 3 plus 5 equals 8, okay? Well, the brain isn't quite ready for it, and so what do we have to do? Repetition, right? Lots of exercises. And so repeat. They get through the end of first grade, they finally mastered this. Now, second grade comes along, what are we going to do? We're going to take the same subject, but we're going to make it a little more difficult, right? Okay, so we make the math a little bit more difficult. And we have problems like 14 plus 16, a little bit harder than it used to be, but the brain isn't quite ready for it, and so what do we have to do? Repeat, right? Lots of repetition to drill it into the brain. Anyone have the answer for this problem? 30. Okay, thank you. Making sure we're all paying attention. Now, third grade rolls around, what are we going to do? Take the same subjects. Now, they've forgotten it all because of the summer slides, so we have to review the previous 2 years, and we start doing more difficult problems. And the brain isn't quite ready for it, so there's a lot of repetition. And again, I'm not saying we teach these exact things in each grade, but this is what's called the spiral approach, where you take the same subjects, you learn the same subjects each year. Rather than learning them conceptually, you just drill them into the mind, and the brain's never quite ready for it. And so you take the same subjects, and you just have to keep learning them over and over and over. Anyone have the answer on this one? All righty, very good. Now, fourth grade, what are we going to do? Review the previous 3 years, do a lot more repetition. So we make it more difficult. I'll let you calculate that one for a moment. Anyone have it? Close. 2592. All right. All right. Obviously, the point here was not to do the math, but this is how curriculum works. You take the same subjects, you repeat them each year, and you just make them a little more difficult. And so there's a lot of repetition and therefore a lot of wasted time. Imagine a different scenario. Let's suppose that in first, second, and third grade, we were not sitting the child down in the classroom and having them do books, but rather we're learning from everyday life. Can you learn math in everyday life? Yeah. How about go to the kitchen? Can you learn some math in the kitchen? Yeah, they can learn in a real life way, right? They can learn, and here's the important thing, they can learn conceptually. I remember a mother told me, I can't teach my child math because he's adding millions and I don't have millions of apples in the kitchen. I said, no, you're still not quite getting it. If you understand the concept of addition and you understand how it actually works, then you can apply it to any situation, okay? So if you're learning practically in everyday life, take a fourth grader and you say, you know what, it's time we take what you already understand conceptually and we apply it to paper. What's 3 plus 5? Oh, that's 8. All right, here's how you write it. And you show them how to do that on paper. Okay, simple. Hey, what's 14 plus 16? 30. Okay, let me show you how to write that. 134 plus 155. Show you how to write that. 1325, 1267. Here's how to calculate that. In 20 minutes or a half of an hour, you could teach a fourth grader who already understands the concepts of addition how to do it actually on paper. So do you see what we mean by catching up? It's not that we wait until the child is 8 or 10 or whatever age, and we start back with kindergarten and we try to force, 6 years of school into a few months. No. They're learning practically through everyday life, and their minds are sharp, so when it comes time to apply themselves to school, they'll quickly come right up to their age level. And this is substantiated by so much research. I think one of my favorite examples of this, also from when I was in Tanzania, and sharing this at a school, and I asked the question at the end, I said, does anyone have any questions? And the principal of the school raised his hand. They call him the head teacher. He said, no, I don't really have a question. I just thought maybe I'd share my experience. He said, I was a herds boy. I took care of my father's cows until I was 13. He said, then I convinced my father to let me go to school. And I went to school, and he said, I learned to read in about 2 days. I said, 2 days? He goes, yeah, it was easy. Once I figured out the difference between the B and the D, I had it. I said, wow. He said, and I caught up with my class level in about a week. He said a couple months later, it was time to take the national exams. And my teacher's like, nah, maybe you better wait. He said, school's been easy. Let me give it a try. He took the exams, scored top of the school. I said, wow, that's an interesting story. Thank you for sharing your experience. Does anyone have any questions? One of the teachers raised his hand. Well, I don't really have a question, just thought maybe I'd share my experience. He said, I was a herds boy also until I was 12. Convinced my father to let me go to school, and I learned to read in about a week, caught up with my class level in a couple of weeks, took the national exams a few months later, scored top of the school. And I thought to myself, wow, there's a couple of geniuses here. I said, thank you. Those are pretty cool stories. Anyone have any questions? Another teacher raised his hand. Well, I didn't really have a question, just thought I'd share my experience. I was a herds boy, and you know the story. And I heard that story several times, actually. It was fairly normal there, especially for our firstborn of the family, to have to wait for a younger sibling to grow up enough to help take care of the cows before he could go off to school. And these young people, these children, would do very, very well in school. I'm not suggesting that, your child needs to be herding cows until they're 13 and don't learn any academics. Certainly you can learn some academic things through everyday life, as we've already talked about. But this was just an example to me of the power of being in that natural environment. It was so strengthening to the mind. They had learned problem solving. They learned to figure things out. They were interested in learning, so that when you put them in the classroom environment, they're like, okay, I can handle this too. And they caught right up very quickly. Just an example of God's methods. I have another friend. They were Brazilian, actually, and they were living in a state here in the U.S. for a while that was very free in their homeschooling laws. They were homeschooling their children. And she said the mom told me the story, she said we had a pretty relaxed homeschooling environment. We learned a lot from everyday life. We didn't do a whole lot out of the books. Her son was 12, and she always felt kind of bad because he hadn't completed a full grade in a long time. Yes, he was learning stuff all the time, reading books and learning from various textbooks and learning from everyday life, but wasn't really going through a traditional curriculum grade by grade. She always felt like, well, maybe he's missing out on something. Well, the time came that they needed to go back to Brazil. Homeschooling in Brazil was a lot more difficult. They needed some documentation. So they said, oh boy, we've got a problem. Here we haven't been doing any of the normal curriculum. We're just learning from everyday life, lots of family time, reading together, stuff like this. How in the world is he going to be able to do okay in getting, she's like, how am I going to get this documentation that I need? So she applied for a national exam that would grade him and tell her at what grade level he was at for all the different school subjects. So she got the exam. It was done online, and she told her son, take it one subject at a time, take breaks, keep your mind fresh. We really need you to do well on these subjects. Well, he was so excited to take the test that he didn't listen, and he just took them all. It took him, I forget how long, it was like 7-8 hours it took him to go through all these subjects, take all these tests. And she's just like, oh, we have failed. He's so tired. He's not going to do very well on these tests. But it was what it was. They sent off the exams, and a couple of weeks later, they received the results. And she's like, all right, we're going to see just how bad we've done. She looks in the results. 8th grade. He's 12, remember? 8th grade. On that, well, okay, that's one subject. He must have done well there. 9th grade. 10th grade. English was their second language. He scored it, I think it was 9th grade level in English. She's like, how is that possible? Then she saw a couple of subjects. There were subjects 11th grade, 12th grade. She's like, how in the world? There were a couple of subjects who was labeled PHS. She said, oh, PHS. Okay, those are the ones he failed at. I probably haven't taught him those. She looked back in the indication, what that meant. Post-high school. Her son's like, Mom, what does that mean? I guess you're done with school, she said. So obviously he had no problems going back to Brazil with those results. But it was just an indication of the power of God's methods. She told me the story, and this is really key. This is true learning. He had advanced far beyond what she was able to even do. She remembered there was a vocabulary word or something on one of the tests, and she had no idea what it meant, but he had gotten it right. And she's like, how did you know that word? She goes, oh yeah, 3 years ago, we were at such and such a conference, and the presenter was using it as part of his talk. And he remembered it from then. And that was just that strong mind that had been built through the practical work and the more hands-on learning environment. So I'm not saying that every child is going to excel academically like that, but it's a good reminder of the benefits of following God's methods. And so we come to our final point, and that is spirituality. This is, of course, the most important. Education is a failure unless we develop the spiritual strength in our children. The early years are a critical window of time for the development of spirituality, for cause to affect reasoning, emotion, relationships, behavior management, language skills, memory skills, moral understanding, conscience, and character development. All of these capacities, the foundation is laid in the first 7 years of a child's life. I believe Satan understands that pretty well. So he's trying to get us to focus. He's trying to get parents to focus on things that aren't as important during these first few years. He wants them to get distracted with the academic training so they don't focus on the character development in the early years. You see, the early years are a critical period for the areas of the brain that lay the foundation for spiritual strength. We've had a tendency in times, I don't know how many of you have looked into this research, I don't know how many of you have heard the statements from the Spirit of Prophecy. Until the age of 8 or 10, parents should be the only teachers of their children. They should be learning from nature. They should be learning out of doors. All these things. We've had a tendency to look at that as telling us what not to do. Don't teach the academics, right? But that's really not the point of the counsel. The point of the counsel is telling us what we should be doing, and that is focusing on character development in the first years of a child's life. And what the science is showing to us now is this is the critical window of time. I could show you so much science. Research from Child Development, Journal of Child Development, said that a child's conscience is laid in the first 3 years of their life. And a lot of other research that we could look at. God is giving parents a window of opportunity to focus on character development. And really the message here that God is trying to tell us, character development requires so much time, you don't have time for the academic stuff. That can come later. You can learn that just as well later, but you can't develop a character for eternity with the same level of success that you will by starting early. Don't misunderstand me. Of course, you can develop a character for eternity no matter what has happened in your past, no matter any age. But it's much easier at an early age. And this is the point that God is trying to get across to us. Parents, especially mothers, should be the only teachers of such infant minds. You look in the context, she says infancy extends to through the age of 7. They should not educate from books. I don't know how much more clear that can get. Books are not the source of instruction at this age. The children generally will be inquisitive to learn the things of nature. They will ask questions. Did God know something about children? They will ask questions. Children love asking questions, right? They will ask questions in regard to the things they see and hear. And parents should improve the opportunity to instruct and patiently answer these little inquiries. They can, in this manner, get the advantage of the enemy and fortify the minds of their children by sowing good seed in their hearts, leaving no room for the bad to take root. The mother's loving instructions at a tender age is what is needed by children in the formation of character. And you know, this is a principle we find in the Bible also. Solomon talks about it when he says, to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. Jesus talked about it when he said, first the blade, then the ear, after that the full corn in the ear. I'm curious. I know I'm speaking to an urban audience here. Has anyone ever grown corn? Anyone who grown corn? No? Okay, we have one corn farmer here. All right, one here. Right. Perhaps some of you have planted something, even if it's not corn. And you plant your little plants, and you come out a couple of weeks later, and you look at those little plants, and you see they're sprouting, right? They're coming up. And it's so exciting to see those little plants coming up. What do you do at that point? Do you look at those little corn plants and say, I don't get it. I wanted corn. I don't have corn. I planted corn. I don't have corn. Is that what you say? No, you say, hey, I have corn. This is exciting. When you don't really have corn, right? You just have plants. You have corn plants. And you hope for the promise of corn. You have a promise of corn. You hope for the future harvest, right? I love this example that Jesus gave. There's a beauty in that little plant. A beauty peculiarly its own. Why would we want to force it? You don't take those little plants and say, all right, come on now, hurry up and start pulling on them and get them to grow faster. It wouldn't work, right? You'd kill the plant. There's a beauty in childhood. Why do we want to force that to mature more quickly? The gradual development of the plant from the seed is an object lesson in child training. He who gave this parable created the tiny seed, gave it its vital properties, and ordained the laws that govern its growth. So we've come full circle now. We've come back to what we started with. Parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parent should open before them God's great book of nature. The only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be the open air. Have we seen enough science to support this? Do we need more evidence? It aligns perfectly, right? We've had a little bit of a tendency to kind of look at this and say, well, that's a little old-fashioned. Maybe it doesn't apply now. But the more the research that comes out, the more we see how absolutely applicable it is. So I want to challenge us, as I did last night. Read the counsel. Take that book education. Take this precious advice that the Lord has given us. Read it, study it, obey it. Let's not wait for the world to prove God right. Let's trust in what he's told us and be obedient to that. All right. Amen. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for the blessing of this counsel and all this research that's available to us. Lord, help us to obey, help us to trust you, and help us to move forward in faith. Be with us now as we continue throughout this day, and we ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 4 o'clock for our last session. And please write your questions down. If you have any questions on what we've just talked about, you're wondering about how to apply it, how to reverse damage, things like that, write it down. We're going to address that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. I just need to